So we've got our lovely exports either from the Revit render cloud or from Inkscape. And of course, we're ready to put our boards together, aren't we? Well, actually, no. It's always a good idea to do a little post-render processing using Photoshop to really bring out the best in your project. And let me show you what I mean. I've chosen a particularly nasty view here. This is a view of the front of the project. You can see that there's a window and it's creating a shadow in the space. And to differentiate that, this is the electrically lit view. And what I'd like to do is kind of blend those. I'd like to get some of that nice effect from the front of the space, but I'd also like to get just a little bit of the electric lighting as well. Now, the easiest way to do that is to select the area of the front of this that I think is going to be the most valuable when I want to bring back on the electric lighting. And I'm going to use a combination of lassos and rectangular tools. And you can see here that just by selecting an area, feathering it, and then deleting part of it, I can really create a sense of some of the daylight coming in, and but also have the electrically lit view available. Now, I just deleted it here, but if I undo so that I get my selection back, I can also make a new layer via cut. And in addition to allowing me to turn on and off this extra piece, I can also lower its opacity. And now I can kind of get a little bit of blending going on between the daylighting and the electric lighting. Now, of course, that just blends the lighting a little bit. I'll turn that off so you can see the difference. In fact, maybe I'll turn off this other layer. Now, sometimes your rendering looks pretty good, but perhaps the shadows are a little too dark or unrevealing. In fact, I think this daytime view is actually much worse. You see how washed out the underside of the front of the space is, but then under the stairs you can hardly see anything because it's so dark. Well, there is a filter to the rescue. If you go to the filter pull-down menu and choose what's called the Camera Raw filter, or Shift-Control-A. And what this will do is call up a menu, and let me just zoom in a little bit here, and you can see there are different parts of the space that you can look at in preview, but then the sort of meat of the tool here is on the right. There are all these sliders that you can adjust. So for example, let's say we want to get rid of some of this dark shadow. There is a shadow slider. Now, of course, this is not re-rendering it, but what it's doing is it's changing the histogram here on the right. You can see if I try to totally get rid of those shadows, it does cause some distortion, but it actually does a not halfway bad job. I can also remove or add highlights. In this case, I'm getting kind of blasted out the window by the daylighting, so I can remove the highlights. You can also fiddle with the contrast, although I will warn you that your colors can kind of go haywire when you do that. This isn't too bad. Exposure is kind of an overall control, so if the overarching image is kind of dark, you can modify it that way. Finally, there's a few other things. The whites, you can make them whiter or not so white. And the blacks, this is kind of the white point and the black point. You can modify those. There are a few other things. They don't always have much of an effect, but it's worth trying them. Adding texture and or clarity sometimes gets you a little bit richer kind of color. You see how the carpet really comes out nicely there. Finally, you can fiddle with the saturation. I find sometimes the colors are a little bit much. If you tone them down by just dragging that saturation a little bit, you can get an image which is a little kind of softer and a little easier. Now, all of this depends on the color rendition of your screen. It is possible to get your screens color calibrated. Probably if the print lab staff will be able to do it. And then you'll really get a good sense of what these colors look like. Screens are not 100% accurate unless you go into the print lab and look at those beautiful, wildly expensive Mac computers. And if you open your drawing in Photoshop on those machines, those are essentially color calibrated. They're going to look an awful lot like they will when they print. Now, the other issue is, what if you're not printing? What if you're projecting on a screen or showing it on a laptop? Well, then you'll want to calibrate the colors to look best on that device. And if you don't know, well, then you're just kind of going to have to go with your best guess. Anyway, click OK, and it will apply the filter to the entire scene. And what you'll see, this layer, this is the original Street View, it's just a separate layer here. These filters only apply to the current layer. So the background layer here, this electrically lit scene, if I want to, say, blend the daylit and electrically lit scene, I will have to apply a filter to this one as well. Finally, that camera raw filter can work really well on other drawings. Let me take a look at my rendered section here, and I'm just going to apply the camera raw filter here and see if we can get a little nicer look, perhaps lighten up these shadows a little bit. And there you have a much nicer drawing. Now, both of these drawings actually can benefit from a couple of other things. The one that I like to add is line work. Let me turn on my line work over here. I've exported this from Revit. I did have to change the view template to be something a little simpler so that I could get a nice clean section that's just black and white. And then in Photoshop, I placed that layer embedded here, and I made sure that the blending mode is multiply. Now, these are things we may have touched on last year when we got our first introduction on touching up drawings in Photoshop. And this blending mode, this multiply blending mode, will make anything that's white essentially disappear. Anything that's black will become opaque. Now, there's not a lot of white or black in this drawing, but you'll see when I change it to multiply, things like the stairs railings become much clearer. And I happen to like the look of having a little bit of line work in there. Now, sections do tend to be very crisp drawings, so I would recommend, if you want line work out of Revit, to absolutely use the Adobe Print menu. And let me show you what I mean. And here's my perspective view that I want to export a line drawing. But in this case, instead of a solid line, I did a little fiddling around with some of those view graphic display properties to get something a little more interesting. Again, I wanted black and white. So when you go to the Print menu, Control P, obviously select Adobe PDF and check the properties and make sure that it says high quality print. That's the first step. The other thing is choose a really big sheet size. Arch D is a really big print size. Okay, click all right. And the other thing you'll want to check is your setup. And let's see here. In theory, it should fit to the page and center it. And remember, even our orthographic views that we rendered, they're not really to scale anymore. They're not on a sheet. They're just images in good old Photoshop. So we can't really say that they're a specific size. So just making them fit to page and get them as high a quality as possible. When you click OK, it will export the image onto your computer, and then you can place that into Photoshop. And here's what that looks like. It's placed into my drawing. Now, the simplest editing you can do in this view is you can absolutely just make it the multiply blending mode. And that works really nicely as a simple effect. You see we get the overlay of the lines, we get a little bit of transparency. Now, of course, if I want to get rid of anything, for example, this strange guy who seems to be standing on the sculpture, I will have to rasterize this layer. So just right-click on the layer, that's the offending layer, and choose Rasterize. And you can select more than one layer at a time to rasterize. But anyway, you can use any number of tools. You could try the magic wand, or you could just select the guy and delete him. just be aware that when you delete, you're going to be deleting off of this white layer. So if you were planning to leave the white layer, you might want to try a different tack. I'm going to undo that. And what I mean by that is if I'm just in this multiply mode and I delete the guy, there's no one knows the better because I can just hit delete and he's gone. However, if I make this a white layer, normal, now I have a hole in my white layer, so I better treat this a little differently. A little trick that you can do, you can select the area that you want to modify. I'll just select a little bit here. And we can try this option where we go to Edit, Fill, and we hope that the object, we can fill it basically with white. And what that will do, any selected area we have will get filled with white. So you can kind of fill it in that way. You could also paint it white. There's any number of different ways to eliminate the guy. One other fun thing you can do with these black and white images is you can make your drawing fade from color to black and white. Let me show you what I mean. I can just select an area here, and I'm going to give it a pretty decent feather by right-clicking on it, maybe 200 pixels. And then I can just delete it. And you can see here that there's my lovely drawing fading to black and white. You can even invert this layer so that it fades to white on black just by adding an invert filter to this layer. Oops, did I get invert? Now, of course, the invert layer looks a little funny because it's also inverting the colors. What we want to do is we want to join these two layers. I could just select them and merge them, but just in case I decide I don't like this, I'll just hold down the Alt key, and this will link this one layer and show you what it looks like. It's basically turning the black lines into white lines and the white lines into black lines. And that's another fun option that you can choose. Or I can just turn off that filter and make it the other way. Another fun thing that we actually learned this last semester was how to add light beams into our project. And of course, they're not real, but they're awfully fun to add in. And just to review, the way you do that is you draw kind of a polygonal selection area where you want the light to kind of look like it's going. I'm actually going to draw it over this column here. So now I have a selection area. I'm going to feather it. Maybe just 50 feathers, 50 pixels to get it a little. Actually, that's almost too much too. Maybe we'll make it 25. That's probably plenty for the likes of us. And you can even use your selection tool, and I'm going to hold down Alt to remove part of this selection here so that it looks like it's kind of going behind the column. And then you just draw in a gradient. In this case, if you don't remember, there are these different gradients. The foreground color to transparent is what I want. And I'll just draw it. I think I start over here and I drag it up. Actually, I have that backwards, don't I? There we go. I always start at the wrong side. And you can see that it makes it look like there's light coming out of the ceiling. Now, you might say, well, you know, do you have any, what else you got? Well, there is actually a whole other light rendering filter in Photoshop. What I'm going to do, I'm going to make a blank layer and I'm going to paint it all black. Okay, this is my layer 1 here, and I'm going to call it rendered lighting. And you can use this filter. Just go to the filter pull-down menu, render, and lighting effects. Okay, and I believe we learned about the lens flare last year. This time we're going to look at the lighting effects. And here's the lighting interface. And there's a number of presets. These don't always work great, but they can create some really interesting effects. So for example, if I just choose 3 downlights, I can move these lights. I can use the grips here to kind of change their size and configuration. And this is great when, say, you know, something in Revit just isn't working. You can make some modifications pretty easily. And obviously you can have 3 lights going in 3 different directions if you'd rather. And each light can be controlled independently. You can control its kind of intensity, and the hotspot, which kind of is the brightness, bright area. But then you can also just control how basically the exposure. There are some effects like gloss, which might increase the brightness somewhat. Each light can operate independently, or they can be grouped together. And again, you can fiddle with them. You can also delete them if you want. Here, I'll just make 2. And some people prefer these kind of graphical controls. See how I can drag on different pieces and kind of affect how this light is going to look. There's even a slider here. You can control its intensity by just kind of clicking and dragging on the slider. So you can kind of actually fake in some pretty, pretty nice looking lighting, really just by moving around and copying these different light sources. So if I like one of these, I should be able to duplicate it, maybe. And just click OK. Now what you'll see, of course, is that I have rendered this on a black area. And so it's a little tricky because you can't always see what you're rendering. But you can change the blending mode, and sometimes you can get some real nice effects here. If I choose, for example, soft light or hard light. Hard light's a little harder, but soft light's pretty nice. Overlay, let's see, vivid light. Each of these has a kind of different look to it. Screen basically is the opposite of multiply. Anything that's white is visible. Anything that's black is removed. Anyway, and this is an object. I can select it if I'm on the right layer, and I can just move it over. So if I want to, say, rotate it, maybe I want a slightly different effect. Okay, you get a little nicer kind of fall off when you use the lighting within Illustrator or within Photoshop, but it's a little hard to control sometimes. You can also do these lighting effects right on the actual layer. I don't recommend doing that because it's destructive. You'll lose that layer. Although you can always duplicate your layer and then apply a lighting effect right onto that layer. I'll just add this lighting effect that I just created. And you can see there that it does that effect, but it makes it really dark. So I don't recommend doing that. I'm just going to drag that to the garbage. And one thing we haven't talked about is poche in our section views. And really, it's so important to have your poche be kind of consistent. And what I recommend doing is changing the color of the poche, because the rendered views they don't always do it justice. Also, some things just don't get poche'd properly. And the easiest way is actually, I'm going to just turn off my colored layer so that I just have my black and white layer visible. And I can just dump paint in everything that's supposed to have poche. And the reason I'm doing this is because some things like these beams, they're not showing up correctly. They're rendering strangely because really they're ceilings, not beams. And so Revit gets a little confused. So to add the poche in, I recommend adding a new layer, just a blank layer, and then pick a color that you like. For example, we can do red. And then just use the good old paint bucket to come in and fill the areas. The paint bucket is here hiding under my gradient tool. And just make sure that you click sample all layers. And that way, even though I'm painting on this layer 1, the poche layer, it will see the area below, which is the layer below, which is the other drawing. Oops, except I just painted the walls. Don't do that. And there you have some lovely poche. And one nice thing about having the poche and the line work all on their separate layers is that if I do something like draw in some lighting, like I've done here, I can drag it below those layers and it will kind of clip it off as if it was up in the ceiling. Just kind of a nice, easy look to it. And all of your drawings are going to need some representation of lighting and scale figures and some kind of line work to them. I'm expecting you to touch up your drawings for those elements, and also to adjust the exposure using the camera raw filters. Now, it's again a matter of kind of subjective preference, how much you adjust these things, but certainly things like showing the poche as clearly as possible in your plans and your sections is critical for them to read properly. The last type of drawing has the similar parameters to the section and perspective and plan drawings, in that it will need to be adjusted for contrast and lighting and all that, and you'll need to have scale figures, of course. The only difference here is this is the interior elevation that we want. Now, you can't render an interior elevation, but what you can do is render a section and then crop it. And that's really pretty straightforward. Just click the crop tool. Oops, try to click the crop tool. And these little croppers will show up. And obviously you'll want to get it as close to the edge as possible, so that you can eliminate the wall thickness. So if it requires zooming in, of course, it doesn't cost you anything to zoom in. Just make sure that you leave that nice heavy outline that, in this case, I've imported, because I really like the look of that on your interior elevations. They should always have a nice heavy black outline around them. Go to this, and there you go. You've got yourself a nice interior elevation. Of course, I do think actually my background is a little light. I'll probably want to adjust this with my camera raw filter. Oh, that's much better. Other things to look out for are things like I have my studio lights floating here in space, and those obviously are silly looking. The other thing is that I have rendered these with those strange scaly people in them. Not everybody likes these types of figures, or they want to have them on a separate layer so they can make them semi-transparent. So the easiest way to do that is just render the view without all the scale figures in there. You can also use Enscape content if you'd rather render with Enscape. There's a lot of really good plants and other things. And of course, Enscape has some very interesting materials for water and for carpet and grass. So you may choose to render it that way. If you're doing it that way, Enscape has the ability to add in line work live kind of in the Enscape window. So that's obviously a lot simpler than modifying them in Photoshop. The last thing you'll want to do before assembling this board in something like either Adobe Illustrator or Adobe InDesign, or whatever program rows your boat, is check the image size. Just go to File, Image Size. And the key thing here is, remember, in the electronic world, there really isn't any physical size. There's only electronic resolution, number of pixels per inch. Now, right here, the resolution is set to 72. So really, we want this to be 200 pixels per inch. Now, without changing the size, this will change the pixel size of the image. Suddenly it's going to become 5,200 pixels wide instead of whatever it was before. This increases the file size significantly. Now, the other thing you can do, if you know the size of your drawing, you can, like the size that it's supposed to be, which you can get from the drawing in Revit. You can actually get the crop region size. You could type that in here. I have a suspicion that this interior elevation is not supposed to be 26 inches wide. If it's whatever it is, 40 feet at 1/4 inch scale, it's going to be 10 inches. So you can actually set the size up correctly here if you know the size. If not, you will have to size any orthographic views once you get into InDesign. But this will save you some time, and you should do this with every one of your drawings. Make sure that they are 200 pixels. They should all be the same resolution. Does that mean you have to open up every single drawing that you're going to be putting into this project? Actually, it does. And it's just good policy, because what you will find is that if one of your images is not the correct resolution, you'll spot it now before it's being presented in front of the entire class. And what exactly is in this presentation, you may be wondering? Well, true to form, I have made you a nice little shopping list, and I'm always wary of this, but then I always end up doing it anyway. This is the assignment here on Canvas. And obviously, schematic design presentation is what we're doing. And what I'd like you to do, we are not going to print a board, but I would like you to lay out your drawings on a single presentation style board. And this should include all of your drawings and any ancillary information, who your artist is, and all of the required kind of design elements, the custom desk and all that kind of stuff. And there's a number of different things that I was hoping you would have, including an object imported from SketchUp and a backlit logo, which you can create using a decal or other devices, glowing material. And then there's a number of other things, which at this point, if you don't have a chair in your project, then I'm a little worried that you're behind. But anyway, the main drawing shopping list here, I'd like you to have 3 fully rendered high quality perspectives adjusted in the manners described in this video, and of course add in any other features which you think you'll need. If you don't like the scale figures that come in with a rendered view from Revit, don't use them. Use the Enscape ones and render it in Enscape. And if you don't like those, go to the internet and collect some scale figures, as you learned last semester. And those videos, by the way, from last semester are still available on YouTube. Finally, you'll need a number of smaller views, your custom light fixture, your front desk. These are more like vignettes. And I would also like you to have one vignette, which is a zoomed in view of some telling detail. This does not have to be a 20-inch wide drawing, but typically it is some very small detail which you think is indicative of kind of the aesthetic of your project. Perhaps it's a bunch of flowers sitting on the reception desk or something like that. I'd also like you to have the 2 rendered sections that we worked on in class, the longitudinal and transverse. I'd also like you to have 4 interior elevations. Now, you and I know that actually those are rendered sections that you've broken apart into interior elevations. And you're probably wondering, well, why don't we just put the sections? Because I want to make sure you know how to do interior elevations. After all, you are interior architecture students. It would be good to know how to draw them correctly. You have already, I believe, created one rendered floor plan of the main floor. I'd also like you to create an axonometric of the upper floor. And this is that default 3D view that we've been using for all the other renderings. Just crop away the roof so that we can see into the second floor and then render it. You can also crop away the first floor so that we don't see that in your rendering. Also, in each of the drawings, you should have plenty of scale figures in any vertically oriented drawing. So that means if it's a section, if it's an elevation, or if it's a perspective or an axonometric, you need people in your drawings. And you need not just one, but many people. Remember, we design for human activity. We should probably have humans in our projects. So finally, things like your name would be good, and what class this is, and maybe even the name of your gallery. And how am I going to grade this monster? Well, obviously, I want you to be able to produce high quality renderings that are going to look good at the schematic design stage. But I also will be grading you on the success of modeling. So not just the renderings, but did you actually create fixtures, lighting, and the like that is interesting and challenging. Obviously, if you create a shoebox for a light fixture, that it may look great, but it may also not be the most challenging. And of course, I will be grading on the layout of the board, which is why we have a draft due next week of the board layout. But I would ask, when you put together this presentation, include that single board at the start and at the end. It's really nice to talk about a project with that board up there. And it can be horizontally or vertically oriented, and it can be any size that you want, although some of us have figured out that 36 inches is a magic number because it works really well with our printer. Actually, 35 works even better if you want a full bleed, because then you can trim off the edges. But then in your presentation, and you can use PowerPoint, but for extra credit, you can use Prezi, which zooms in and out. It's a little more complicated to use, but it's a lot more fun and makes you a little woozy. I'd like you to have slides with each or several of the drawings on each of these slides. So, for example, if you have two perspective views of the main gallery space, you can put those on the same slide. The axonometric and the plan may go together. Remember, we're presenting on a screen, so it will be horizontally oriented, so you can fit all those things in there. And you can present them either by creating a slide and just dropping the drawings onto that slide and format it that way. You can also zoom in on those parts of your board if you'd rather do it that way. I'm amenable to either one. Finally, there's always extra credit, because who doesn't love extra credit? And a rendered reflected ceiling plan is actually pretty hard to do. If you can do that, then put it on your boards, and we'll see how well it all comes out. And if it does come out well, I'll give you extra credit. The other thing is that because we know Enscape, and we know Enscape can do an animation that is fully rendered at a high quality, well, you can create a rendered walkthrough of your space that looks at some of the art and perhaps some of the other features, your cool floor patterns or other things that you've created. I know that that's hard to do, but I also know that some of you are very far along in your projects, and this is kind of just throwing down a challenge to see if you can get that extra good grade. So anyway, and we have approximately a week for this assignment. So get to it.